Thank you, Maggie. Like many Asian American children, I began to study the violin at a young age. And indeed, at the age of 7, I picked up the violin for the first time. I didn't know it then, but through my study of the violin, I was exposing myself to some of the best music ever created. The years went by, and I began to study and I began to listen to many other types of music. And while most people around me treated each genre of music differently, such as those who said rock music is obviously the best, but country music, no, that's garbage. Or pop music isn't real music, but R&B, that's the real stuff. I never really let this prejudice influence my musical tastes. And as a result, I was able to make connections that would have been difficult to make had I analyzed each genre as its own separate entity. Today, I want to focus on connecting two genres in particular, classical music and electronic dance music. And although they may seem pretty different, I think that they're actually rather similar and should each be respected, not just within their genres, but without these labels as well. But not everyone's familiar with these terms, so let's break them down. Classical music is an umbrella term commonly used to describe the style of Western music developed from 1550 to the early 1900s. Now, any true classical nerd would remind me that there's technically another classical era from about 1550 to 1830, but for our purposes today, we will be using the broad definition. And classical music is widely revered, with artists such as Mozart, Bach, and Handel, who are regarded as giants in the music world. Electronic dance music, on the other hand, has two defining qualities. One, it does not rely on the use of acoustic instruments, such as the guitar or piano, but rather it either partially or completely uses electronic instruments, those which are digitally created by a synthesizer, such as this one. Two, although vocals are often featured, an electronic dance song always has a section of the song where the vocals take a backseat and the instruments become the main focus. And electronic dance music has recently experienced a huge spike in popularity, yet it still carries a stigma, probably because the way it's created is still unfamiliar to many, and reports of drug use at concerts have been unfairly associated with the genre. With this information, you may say that these two genres seem pretty far apart, but really, I see EDM, electronic dance music, as a modern reincarnation of classical music, and here's why. Both genres rely on the use of many different instruments, more so than other genres. Country music may have its acoustic guitars and its banjos, but classical music has an entire orchestra with strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussions. The amount of sounds the orchestra has at its disposal is unmatched by most other genres. But not electronic music. With modern synthesizers, an EDM artist today can create any kind of sound he wants. A defining characteristic of both genres, the use of many different instruments gives the composer more freedom with which to write his music and express his ideas. Now, a lot of people may look at EDM and say that it's not music, or that it doesn't take much skill to create, or certainly not as much skill as it does to create a classical piece. Kind of like the Kraft mac and cheese of the music world. And this kind of reputation would suggest that the genre would fizzle out. But Skrillex, a Grammy Award-winning producer, sees it differently and said this in an interview with the New York Times. To me, it's so cool that we live in an era where people think people have no talent if they make computer music. It just shows how young it still is and how relevant it's going to be for a long time. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, but what I think this gets at is that since EDM has so much more to offer than what first meets the eye, it's bound to stick around. And this has happened before. Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring was first performed in the May of 1913, and it was so radical for the time that its audience was furious, going so far as throwing tomatoes on the stage. Surely nobody in the audience that day would have guessed that it is now considered to be one of the most influential pieces of the 20th century. The Rite of Spring was unpopular not because it wasn't music, but because it challenged what we consider to be musical. Today, EDM may not seem very musical to some, but that's okay. These artists are constantly breaking barriers and challenging its listeners to accept it as the real deal. And it's working. Electronic dance music is truly gaining a big presence among the listeners of the world. Last year, Kygo, a relatively new name in the world of EDM, with hits such as Stole the Show and Firestone, was crowned as the fastest artist in the world to reach 1 million total plays on Spotify. That means that, up to date, The amount of time spent listening to Kago's music on Spotify alone amounts to more than 7,000 years of human life. Now, Kago learned how to make his music with just a laptop and a MIDI keyboard while studying at the University of Edinburgh. The software Kago uses to make his music looks something like this. And although the way Kago makes his music is very different from how we typically see people make music, such as this or this, Kago's level of success proves that what he makes is unquestionably music. Now, the cross between EDM and classical can be found at the small scale as well. Zed is a successful electronic artist with hits such as Clarity and Stay the Night. And his musical training and his electronic dance music both showcase how the two genres need not be looked upon so separately. A classically trained musician, Zed began the piano at age 4. And it was only after listening to iconic electronic artists, Daft Punk and Justice, that he decided to make his own electronic dance music. In his electronic dance music, his appreciation for classical is evident, often including as many acoustic instruments as it does electronic instruments. Take a listen to the first few seconds of his song, Stay the Night, and pay careful attention to what instruments he uses.
I know that we are upside down, so hold your tongue and hear me out. I know that we were made to break, so what, I don't mind.
Well, what did you hear? The only thing you can hear are the voice and the piano, because that's all he uses. It's not until 45 seconds into the song that you learn of its electronic nature. So sure, it's a song made for dancing at the club, but it's also a piano ballad. Listen to the climax of the song here. Now compare that to how Zed reinterprets the same portion of the song on the piano in this acoustic version he later recorded and released. In interviews, Zed almost always mentions how he wishes to create timeless music, just like Beethoven and Mozart did so long ago. So releasing new versions of his music with more traditional instruments is a way for him to further connect his music with the past. And Stay the Night isn't a unique case either. While writing this talk, I came across a song, Alan Walker's Faded, which I mentioned on an earlier slide, that has become pretty popular lately. Just like Stay the Night, it begins with piano and vocals and develops into an energetic electronic song. But not only that, you can imagine my excitement when I found out Alan Walker actually released another version of this song with just acoustic instruments. So what originally sounded like this. Was later transformed into this. Both Stay the Night and Faded established the relationship between EDM and classical music, with their composers incorporating these classical elements into their songs and taking the time to create these classical-style reinterpretations, what I see as bridges between the two genres. One last similarity I want to point out is these genres' effects on the rest of the music world. The classical era was certainly the most influential ever. It laid down the foundations for generations of composers, and as any classical enthusiast would tell you, there's a reason it's still being played hundreds of years later. Likewise, elements of electronic dance music have already become standards among other genres. Huge artists such as Rihanna, Justin Bieber, and Coldplay are incorporating elements such as electronic instruments and a large instrumental section in their music to great success. And they do this not really as a tribute to EDM, but because these elements are becoming more popular among listeners as a whole. Just as the first classical composers, with their bold ideas, led the classical movement, EDM artists today, with their modern ideas and modern tools, are trying to bring all musicians into a new era of music, the effects of which we are already beginning to see. So I want you to look between the lines. I've been trying to prove to you that EDM and classical music aren't actually that different. Not just to tell you the nuances of these genres, but because I want to show that these divisions are superficial. No matter the kind, all music is music and should be treated as such. The spread of EDM to other genres is just another way these divisions are blurring. If we quit trying to differentiate everything, we will realize that our world isn't split up into separate groups, but rather is interconnected in beautiful ways. Thank you.